Today, we bring together our previous sessions' understandings and learnings to try to understand this question of how do we establish valuable competitive positioning. So let me begin with the story of Hyundai. Hyundai in the automobile manufacturing business is an interesting player in that they entered, especially in the US market, as a low-cost player trying to establish a viable position with small, energy-efficient vehicles. Over time, they have expanded their repertoire and have moved now into higher-end products, positioning themselves differently in the market than they were, let's say, 10, 20 years ago. So this gets back to our question that we raised the very first day, the strategist challenge. How do we create and sustain value? How do we identify valuable competitive positions? How can we help a company like Hyundai understand where is the best position for them in a competitive market? To help us understand this, we're going to evoke something called the generic competitive positions that were proposed by our good friend Michael Porter of Five Forces fame. These are, of course, as the name suggests, just generic positions, and we'll talk about how there is more complexity in how we think about positioning than these just four positions. But they're a very useful way to help shape our thinking about the opportunity sets available to firms within industry. Let me start by considering the two axes that define our little 2x2 here. On one axis, we have the source of competitive advantage. On the other, we have the competitive scope within the industry. So let me start with competitive advantage. This is something we talked about in last session in terms of capabilities here. And the idea, again, is there's two general sources of advantage that a firm might have. They might be either low cost or they might be differentiated. They have a demand advantage where customers have a higher willingness to pay. So imagine the following just graphically. We have an industry here where there's an industry average player who is charging $6 for their product and it costs them $5 to manufacture. They make a profit of $1. And just for argument's sake, let's argue that this is the marginal producer in the industry. Basically, the person who just barely covers their opportunity cost of being within that industry. So they're doing all right, but not great within the industry. We then might have a low-cost firm also selling their product for $6 and customers willing to pay for that, but their cost structure is lower, so they get a profit margin of $2 versus $1 in the marginal player case. On the other side, we have a differentiated player. Now, this player may very well have a higher cost structure than our marginal player, let's say a $6 cost, but because customers are willing to pay more for their product, let's say $8, they have a higher profit margin as well, similar to our low-cost firm, at least in this example. The second axis we want to consider is competitive scope. Now, for today's purposes, we're going to use the term competitive scope to refer to the extent to which a firm targets multiple product market segments within one industry. In our next session, we're actually going to talk about competitive scope across industries. But for today's purposes, we're thinking about how does a firm position itself in one single industry? Well, recognize that industries may be segmented into many different individual product markets. The easiest is probably to think about geographic markets. Do we compete in Europe or Asia or the US? Do we compete even more locally, perhaps on a regional basis, or maybe even a community basis? Here in Charlottesville, Virginia, perhaps you have a store and it's competing in that Charlottesville market. Clearly, markets could also be characterized by different types of product lines. There are different types of customers who have different types of preferences, and those might be a way to segment the market as well. In the automobile industry, it's interesting to think about high-end players like Porsche in the luxury sports car business. And then, of course, we have players who are aiming for more of a mass market, smaller part of the market as well. So these two dimensions here, source of competitive advantage, whether it's cost or differentiation, or sometimes called uniqueness, and the competitive scope within the industry, whether it's narrow or broad, defines the following 2x2 and suggests four generic competitive positions. For those who have a broad competitive scope trying to sell to a wide part of the market and are looking for a cost advantage, we can refer to that as a cost leadership position. For those of you looking for uniqueness, but to a broad segment of the market, we can call it a differentiation position. Then we have our narrow positions. We have focused low-cost players who are targeting a specific segment of the market with a low-cost strategy. And then we have those targeting a specific segment of the market with a uniqueness strategy, which we refer to often as a niche strategy within an industry. So let me talk about each in turn. So cost leadership, once again, keeping your costs lower than the competitors to generate these rents vis-a-vis the marginal producer that we talked about before. Players in this type of position tend to offer standardized products that are broadly acceptable, and they do so often at the lowest price. Classic example of this would be Henry Ford and his Model T. Henry Ford was once famously asked, what colors could I get my Model T in? And he responded, you could get it in any color you want as long as it's black. And the idea here was he created one standardized product, the Model T, that was broadly acceptable to the market and ended up being the low-cost player and, in essence, low-price player as well within that market space. So common examples, we can think of many. Walmart in the retail business, McDonald's in fast food. We discussed in our last session Nucor Steel in the mini mill business, who is a low-cost player there. And then even in services like financial services, we have players like Charles Schwab who are going for a cost leadership strategy. What are the approaches that firms take in these positions? Well, first, they obviously engage in cost cutting as a way to get their cost structure down. Walmart is famous for this. In some industries, we might have high economies of scale, as we've talked about before. Higher economies of scale, if you capture that scale, drives your costs down and allows you to be a cost leader within an industry. In the beer industry, Anheuser-Busch benefits from these economies of scale. In some cases, you use low-cost inputs or even outsource or offshore your production. Dell comes to mind as a player who's been very aggressive in doing this over the years in trying to get their cost structure lower and lower. Similarly, cost leaders tend to minimize overhead costs such as R&D, advertising. Once again, Dell comes to mind as a company who has done this over the years. And then somewhat paradoxically, as we talked about with Nucor, sometimes having the state-of-the-art operations and having continuous improvement allows you to be the cost leader. Once again, Nucor as an example there. So putting out expenses to have state-of-the-art operations might ultimately allow you to be a cost leader. Second strategy, a differentiation strategy. So this is the higher consumer willingness to pay. This is high quality, service, prestige, whatever it might be, but it's the offering of unique features that customers demand. So examples, going back to the retail business, to the extent Walmart's trying to be the cost leader, arguably Target, though it's in the low-cost retailer bracket, is trying to be a differentiated player in that lower market. In consumer electronics and personal computers, we've talked about Apple in the past, clearly a differentiated strategy. You look no further than the price of a Macintosh versus your average PC to see this differentiation strategy at play. Intel, as a company in the microprocessor, trying to have the highest, most successful processors as a differentiation strategy. Going back to automobiles, BMW, a wide variety of products trying to satisfy a broad segment of the market, arguably, but clearly with a differentiation strategy in mind. And then in financial services, we might think about a company like Goldman Sachs as someone who has a high value differentiation play that they have historically used. So what are some of the strategic approaches here? This is where brand often becomes very important, especially for consumer-facing companies. You think about a Nike here who spends a lot on advertising to differentiate themselves from their competitors. In more high technology industries, it might mean being the innovative leader. The way you create differentiation is being on the cutting edge and offering products and services that are innovative. And unlike the cost leader, you're often investing heavily in human resources and R&D and the like as a way to improve your quality of service and prestige and get this higher willingness to pay. Focus low cost, very similar to the cost leadership strategy. The one difference here is you get low cost by focusing your efforts on a narrow segment of the market here. This is a strategy often used by new entrants into a market, especially foreign firms and the like, who are trying to establish a foothold within the industry. We could think about Hyundai approaching that when they first entered the US market. Kia is another example where a focused low-cost strategy could be a great way to enter a market. There are some generic drug manufacturers as another example of low cost, but they focus on particular parts of the market in order to achieve those low cost economies. So the strategic approaches here is you deter rivalry by dividing the market. You pick off one segment of the market here, and you capture economies of scale, but maybe in a narrow sense here. Generic drugs come to mind for that. Finally, we have a niche strategy. So this is now the differentiation strategy, but on a smaller scale. We can probably think of lots of different high-end goods providers that satisfy a niche strategy. Tiffany's as an example in the luxury jewelry market, Porsche in the automobile market. If we go to services, there's any number of boutique consultancies that position themselves as differentiated players within a market. Here, the strategic approach is basically to use your expertise and the narrowness of your position to have greater knowledge and expertise that creates this willingness to pay. In the network systems market, Juniper Networks has been one who historically has tried this strategy of a focus expertise that they have. And then, of course, there are different ways you can build brand loyalty and through that focus. You think about a Porsche or a Tiffany's and how they've successfully done that. So once again, these four competitive positions, 2 by 2 here, creates these four generic positions. Now, of course, in reality, the world isn't this simple, and firms are positioning themselves across these different dimensions here. In fact, you sometimes see firms who are actually pursuing what we might call an integrative strategy. So let me talk a little bit about this. This is the best of both worlds. So this is the idea of offering differentiated products at low cost. Who wouldn't want to do this, right? You think about Toyota. So while Toyota is a broad market player, they have lower cost structure, but they also have differentiation in terms of their quality and the like. We've talked about Southwest Airlines in this context before. Clearly a low-cost player, but at the same time, they have quality in terms of their reliability of their flights and the like that gives them a differentiation advantage as well. So strategic approaches to an integrated strategy, things like total quality management, lean production techniques that have been pioneered in operations, Toyota being a leader in these, are one way in which you can both get quality and low cost simultaneously. Similarly, R&D and innovation might be a way to both get differentiation and low cost, especially if you're pioneering in the production-based technology or in manufacturing. There is a caution here. Our good friend, once again, Michael Porter, suggests you risk getting stuck in the middle here if you pursue an integrated strategy. And there are numerous examples of firms who've tried to be, once again, both differentiated at low cost at the same time and have achieved neither, and as a result have not had much competitive success. I think if one looks at General Motors, especially over the last 10, 15 years, one could argue that they have been stuck in the middle. At one level, they are a differentiated player in the automobile industry. At the other level, they're competing, in essence, in a low-cost part of the market, competing against the Toyotas and the like of the world, and finding it difficult to compete successfully there.